Thank you. Thank you. The objectives for today will be to define digital phenotyping, to give examples of the scientific and clinical opportunities with digital phenotyping, and then also to recognize some of the ethical issues associated with the evolving digital phenotyping technologies. So I've broken this into three parts. Where are you? Okay. So digital technologies, we'll introduce these at first, then we'll talk about the ethical implications, and then we'll talk about policy readiness. And I'd like to start by reading you this story, which I usually read from my screen, but I'll read it here on this tiny, tiny screen here. So you read along if you can. And I want to introduce this scenario of the digital psychiatrist. And this is a future scenario. This is not a current scenario. And this was written by my colleague, John Torres. So Zach has been having trouble at work. And when he comes home, he's exhausted. Yet he struggles to sleep. Everything seems difficult, even walking. He feels like he's made of lead. He knows something is wrong and probably should call the doctor, but that just seems like too much trouble. Maybe next week. Meanwhile, software on his phone has detected changes in Zach, including subtle differences in the language he uses, decreased activity levels, worsening sleep, and cutbacks in social activities. Unlike Zach, the software acts quickly, pushing him to answer a customized set of questions. Since he doesn't have to get out of bed to do so, he doesn't mind. Zach's symptoms and responses suggest that he may be clinically depressed. The app offers to set up a video call with a psychiatrist who confirms the diagnosis. Based on her expertise, Zach's answers to the survey questions and sensor data that suggest an unusual type of depression, the psychiatrist devises a treatment plan that includes medication, video therapy sessions, exercise, and regular check-ins with her. The app continues to monitor Zach's behavior and helps keep his treatment on track by guiding him through exercise routines, noting whether or not he's taken his medication, and reminding him about upcoming appointments. And this is a future scenario, maybe a near-term one even, that people are considering. So let's start by defining digital phenotyping. As defined by one of my colleague, John Torres, who wrote the previous article, it's defined as moment-by-moment quantification of the individual level human phenotype in situ, or in real life, using data from personal digital devices. And this digital devices can actually record a lot of things. They can record voice and give you outputs in MP4 formats. They can include geotag your data and show you where you've been located, GPS files. There's a built-in accelerometer, which can measure your activity, and can even measure your social activity from incoming and outgoing texts. So in your pocket or in your hand or in front of you, or I see many of you have them. Actually, not that many of you are on your phones right now. That's a good sign at first. You have a pocket brain sensor, which has, and I'll tell you a few more of those active things that it has. It has Wi-Fi, so it can track your location, as I mentioned. There's an accelerometer, which I mentioned. There's also an ambient light sensor that can offer information about your sleep environment and can help guide and calibrate light therapy. There's a camera that can track your facial expressions that could reveal mood. There's a touch screen that can indicate how often you've been touching it. There's proximity sensors that can track social behavior, useful in a number of disorders. There's a microphone, so there are also groups that are looking at voice patterns. And you can even have a heart rate sensor in there that detects changes in your nervous system, such as increased anxiety. And certainly there's a Bluetooth device involved with this. And one interesting thing about Bluetooth is a lot of your information is transferred over Bluetooth, right? But Bluetooth is also the least secure mechanism for transferring information. So I mention this because this hints at the level of our preparation for thinking about the utility of these devices and how we might be collecting and storing that information. So on a daily moment-to-moment setting, humans use their potential mobile sensor and data collecting device in their pockets, And 77% of US adults own a smartphone. Many people feel their phone is something they absolutely could not live without. Is there any of you like that? Okay, honest, being honest. Okay. And they're looking at their phones and touching them about 3,000 times a day, 6 to 7 times in an hour. So you'll have touched it 6 or 7 times during this talk here. And 86% of US adults use their mobile device for health information, which is another interesting aspect. So you can start to see how a phone might be able to give a rather intimate depiction of your life, and a lot of information can be gleaned from your cell phone. So what this offers is an opportunity to, in real time, be collecting information about you as you move about the world in your natural setting, and that is a strength and also an ethical challenge. So next I want to talk about clinical data that is collected from non-clinical sources, like social media, not typically meant to be indicating your health status, but perhaps you put information in there about that, like I'm feeling bad today, I feel sick today, my kid made my whole family sick, stuff like that. So for a patient with insomnia, you can get, for instance, data about their timing and hours of one's digital footprint can demonstrate part of the disease's expression. For example, some researchers queried their database of geotagged tweets, which means that they're tagged with the precise latitude and longitude of the tweeter, for various insomnia-related keywords. And they also were able to show that insomnia-related tweets of several Twitter users were able to be used to track symptoms over time, perhaps being able to eventually offer assessments of insomnia from a population health perspective. So I will say that I was at the UN headquarters about a year ago, and the event was just on privacy. And there was this question of when is it unethical actually to not share these kinds of data? Because it was from Twitter data that they are able to assess food shortages, different ways of illness and locations of that. So just that there's this tension point of the benefits of this publicly available information and maybe the privacy violations that come to one who puts this information out there because you simply don't know how that information can be used. Okay, so social media phenotypes for prediction, diagnosis, and intervention. So social media might be able to be used for diagnosis, but also could be used for prediction, and we get into another sticky territory here. So I wanted to first read to you, how many of you use Facebook? You don't have to Facebook friend me. Okay. All right. So do you know that Facebook tracks your suicidal ideation? And if it detects that you seem to be indicating that you are suicidal from a variety of texts, that it will send you some messages and ads, maybe you've seen them, giving you a helpline, right? So is that, how does that feel? Bad? Surprising? Maybe helpful? So what kind of spurred this thing? Okay, so now I've got to read on my tiny screen again. Okay. When Nika Venant killed herself in January, the Miami area teen broadcasted the event for 2 hours on Facebook's popular video live streaming feature, Facebook Live. A friend of hers saw the video and alerted police, but aid did not arrive in time to save the 14-year-old's life. Other young people have also recently posted suicidal messages on social media platforms, including Twitter, Tumblr, and LiveMe. In a bid to save lives, Facebook and other social media giants are now wading into suicide prevention work, creating new alert systems designed to better identify and help at-risk individuals. So a while ago already now, Facebook unveiled a new suite of tools, including the company's first pattern recognition algorithms to spot users who may be suicidal or at risk of lesser harm. So does Facebook did not anticipate people were going to be using this to live stream their suicides, surely. But do they have a responsibility now to be monitoring suicidal ideation and intervening? There are researchers, including some here at Emory, and I see Robert Thorstad in the back, who are doing work to mine social media data. And I also have a colleague at Georgia Tech doing a similar thing. And she's identifying common terms in Twitter feeds to look for patients who are depressed. So De Chudhury and colleagues obtained data on depression rates in the various states from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the behavioral risk surveillance system in 2008. They also compiled a set of different Twitter posts from each state and matched them to the state's name with the user's self-reported location on Twitter over a 6-month period in 2010. And there were a total of approximately 132 million posts over 40 states. And so what you can see above, the green map is a heat map rendering of the prevalence of depression by CDC's measures. So more green means more depressed. And then you can see the map below, the purple map is the heat map rendering from De Chudhury and colleagues obtained through Twitter feeds. And you can see there's some differences, but there certainly is a significant overlap, which indicates that there might be some utility in using Twitter feeds for this. And now this is something a little separate from what I've been talking about, non-clinical information. But there's also work like this going on at Emory where people are doing, I call it opportunistic recording, basically. But patients with epilepsy are undergoing surgical procedures to help identify the site of their epilepsy, perhaps even to ablate it. And in the process, intracortical electrodes are put on in their brain, so just on the surface of their brain. And these electrodes are able to record activity. And recently, there was a study where they were able to actually look at variation of mood by measuring activity in the brain. And then they were able to match that, of course, with the self-reports of the participants. So the uniqueness of the study was that it was the first time we've been able to do this in an invasive way, in a more detailed way, compared to something like non-invasive brain imaging, which gives a really, really crude mark of activity in the brain. So now if you can imagine, so we don't always have to go into the brain to get electrical activity measurements. There are non-invasive ways to do that. You can get EEG caps. There are now commercial caps that aren't necessarily good, but they're out there, and people are using them. And you can start to see how really intimate depiction of your life, your mental status, your thoughts, your feelings, and maybe even your networks, which I'll tell you about later, can be garnered from a bunch of commercially available products, right? And it's not that I'm worried right now that these EEG caps that are commercially available really give meaningful data about your brain. But what it does is set a precedent and a comfort level of being able to use these over time. And technology doesn't tend to get worse, right? It tends to get better. So my suspicion is that this will set a trend of us getting more and more comfortable sharing brain-based data in a number of fun ways to play video games, to enhance performance on, I don't know, there's a whole market for using these for wellness, for making you more relaxed, for helping you be a better athlete. So that now we combine that with your mobile brain sensor, your social media data, and there's a lot we can tell about you. And some of that's going to be helpful, right? And it can, but it's not going to be helpful if people are feeling like their privacy is violated from that. So, of course, the ultimate goal of doing all this recording, again, I want to remind you, is for improving health outcomes. But we also have some ethical challenges that I've been alluding to as well. So I started by saying that the holy grail of neuroscience is trying to connect brain activation to function, right? And we're getting better and better at that. Certainly that's the goal of the BRAIN Initiative and a lot of the initiatives around the globe. And the potential to do this research and the insights that will be revealed for improving human health are unprecedented. We are in a very special and unique time. We will have potential to understand basic mechanisms of human behavior and brain health. We might be able to predict illness and episodes of illness. We might be able to develop treatment, importantly, early interventions. We could present unique opportunities to advance mental health, and techniques could ultimately be expended beyond health, beyond mental health. So you can imagine how this might be valuable in a variety of sectors of one's life. And we're also at an important time because this is an opportunity to maximize the benefit of current trends in neuroscience research. So there is a priority for improving health, improving research and understanding brain circuitry and function, and also data sharing. There's this trend in globally where people are talking about important and deliberate ways of sharing data. And there's this rapid development of naturalistic quantification of behaviors. So we have the opportunity to revolutionize brain health. And the potential to do this research can change the landscape of health. This map kind of illustrates different parts in which, I guess I don't have a cursor here, but different parts of the disease development process where a phone might be helpful, where it could work with other mechanisms in place. So this map here outlines years and then different interveners on the top where you see the different colors. And so take for example, a patient who might develop schizophrenia, you can see that initially the parents technology is not going to eliminate the parents' role, for instance. So they'll still be involved in mental health promotion and parenting, providing support, but they could also build in e-communities where they'll be able to talk with other parents and get support. You could also identify people at risk in a prodromal period, which is a high-risk period that predicts onset of the disease. And then you can also be able to measure first episodes, relapse, and also track wellness and recovery. So you could see how these digital phenotyping technologies could be valuable all the way through. So, however, the opportunities and technologies that make brain and behavioral quantification possible also present ethical challenges. So there is the enormous benefit of continuous recording in naturalistic settings. This is important for a number of reasons because, frankly, it's much more convenient and people are a lot more likely to participate if they don't have to write these record reports because they don't want to do that. And in fact, they might even not be as accurate as something that is just passively collecting information from you throughout the day. There is a possibility for surveillance in a good kind, perhaps, that predicts risk, identifies needs for services, but we also have challenges of normalization, medicalization, and stigma, and I'll speak more about these later. You also have challenges related to privacy, hacking, and cybersecurity, which hasn't been a big part in developing a lot of these apps and other technologies that are being used today. The digital technologies can be helpful for treatment, where you can access online assessment and care, and digital feedback to titrate your care. This also brings up issues related to false positives and unnecessary interventions. And what if you miss somebody who is suicidal? That would be a catastrophic mistake. And then we're in this era of big data. You can get new insights at large scale. So many people are using these social media devices. But depending on how we analyze these, we might also enter an era where we are reinforcing negative biases. And we also don't have a clear path forward on who owns and gets to keep data. For instance, do you get to keep data that you enter into a wellness app? Most of them you don't. So as I mentioned, I'm part of the NIH Brain Initiative's neuroethics group, and we've developed a set of working principles to help guide behavior, and I'm going to use those as a touch point throughout as we work through the ethical issues. And one of the first issues we have to deal with is neuro privacy. So participant trust is a precious commodity, and we have this opportunity for continuous versus episodic recording in the patient's ecosystem in their regular lived experience. We also have the opportunity to be fairly ubiquitous in their life, and we can obtain passive information from sensors and also more actively inputted information that is entered via text with prompts. But as with genomics, the wide-scale use of neuroscience data could lead to re-identifiability. So neuroimaging data amongst these other data could also be something that could be used as basically a neural fingerprint. Re-identification is more likely to be a possibility and actually is something that we should probably just warn people. It's impossible to keep your information private these days. With just your GPS information and four credit card statements, we can very clearly identify who you are. Thank you. And there's something about these data that may be particularly important to protect because they reveal information about your mental state. So one thing about psychiatry that's really important as we think about using these technologies for mental health is that there is no other medical field that can take away your rights like psychiatry can, right? Just a diagnosis can prevent you from being able to consent to things, right? You no longer have capacity. You no longer, you start to give away your legal rights. So this is a really important thing to get right, to be accurate on. There are also new unanticipated legacy uses that could be applied to this information that you're giving. So beyond the clinic, predictive information could go to employers, insurance agencies, and what new kinds of information might be deduced and disclosed by the analysis. And with big data, the whole point of that is that we are creating totally new information from masses of amounts of information. So it's impossible to tell you exactly what that information is going to be used for and to prepare the user who donates that information. There are also networked harms. So have you ever logged into something with your Google account or your Facebook account? No, don't do it. Some people are saying I never do it. Well, if you do, then you have given them all of your Facebook information and that information of those of your friends and their friends. And so if your mom loves to see pictures of your family or your kids and they are very suspicious about surveillance and they have all their privacy settings set on Facebook, it doesn't matter because you already shared that information, right? So there are these network harms that are really hard to anticipate. And who reads those privacy statements? Right? Those are notoriously ineffective. Everybody knows it, but they use them anyway because they're allowed to. Okay. Also with these technologies, we have to be very mindful of this quantified self-movement. Do you know about the quantified self-movement? Quantified self is popularized by Silicon Valley. This also been tied to precision medicine. It's used to quantify information about individual behavior and bodies in an effort to advance health. And there are surely some benefits to that. However, there's an opportunity to also start to put people into categories and to quantify what is good and what is not good. And we already do that to some extent, but we might start minimizing the windows of acceptable variation. Also, how we do comparisons across all these data can also, as I mentioned before, enhance stigma and bias. So groups and group differences are usually defined by criteria that also have important social meanings. So these aren't just scientific boundaries. So geographical regions, race, ethnicity, SES, genealogical ties. So some individuals and groups may be more vulnerable to social risks, and these will be reinforced by scientific generalizations. And underserved communities will report the highest rate of chronic disease, so they'll also likely be benefactors in a way to these kinds of technologies because they're new and they might have better tracking abilities and might be able to get better insights into their symptoms. But they'll also be likely to be recipients of bias and could suffer ultimately from the digital divide, whether that means that they don't have access to digital technologies or they don't understand completely how they work. Okay, and I mentioned this a bit already, medicalization. So medicalization is a social process where non-medical or life or human problems become understood and treated as medical problems. Sometimes that's helpful. Like we used to not believe mental illness was real, right? We used to not believe dystonia was something real or epilepsy. And that, what by real I mean deserves attention. But with these technologies, we can start to set some really hard boundaries about not just your heartbeat and things like that, but about how you think and how you live and how you communicate. So these are really delicate things to be addressing and considering. And it's really tempting to quantify things that we don't understand, right? And if it's easy, we use it and it really becomes ingrained. So consider body mass index, which is not at all tied to health outcomes, but how many of you had your body mass index recorded or discussed at your recent health visit, right? The body mass index and the statistics around it were developed by an insurance company. So as I think about, I see that and I think about these technologies that are largely being developed commercially and start to wonder, what are some trends that we can start seeing ahead of us? What has history shown us? So informed consent, and I mentioned that that's going to be really tricky. So informed consent, we really need to encourage public education and dialogue. And I've mentioned this before about data, but I really want to highlight it. The purpose of big data analytics is to create new, unanticipated knowledge of already existing data. So big data changes how we know, and we can also expect a more complicated ethical implication of what we know. And it's difficult to fully understand the risk of such research as the science continues to evolve and the legacy use and ownership of that data remains really unclear. So how many of you have used Lumosity, for instance? Yeah. So Lumosity actually owns your data when you enter it in, and if they become bankrupt, they can sell off your data as well. And so this is something that some agencies have begun to change, but it's really hard to say, like, okay, well, what are they going to do with that data anyway? There's also this, and I'll bring it up in my next slide, of, I think, broad consent. So broad consent has come with the new common rule. Common rule dictates how informed consent happens, which is supposed to empower people. And what broad consent means is that when you sign into a study, for instance, now you consent to the legacy use of that data, so the further use of that data without having the specifics of that data. This can greatly advance scientific opportunity and researchers and collaboration. However, in the era of big data, there's no way to predict how that information is going to be used or be tracked back to you. So I'll close with talking about policy readiness. So has policy kept up with the science? So are these problems unique to neuroscience? So data and privacy concerns are not entirely different in kind, but maybe in degree. The type of interventions are a little bit different because we can intervene with fundamental features of humans that impact productivity, such as enhancement, or in the rate of change of things like personality, autonomy, and agency with brain interventions. And the nature of information is also a bit different. Scientists and regulators will need to resolve how to interpret objective findings that differ from patient or physician assessment. So in some cases, like in Kathy's talk before ours, she had said maybe that there were new insights revealed, and the participants hoped that to be revealed to them about their mental status, their health, their feelings and thoughts. And in those cases, maybe they admitted that it's okay that that's different from what I've said. But what if there's a critical situation like, we're struggling with pain right now, right? So you go into the legal system and you say that you're in pain, but we don't have activity that suggests in your brain that suggests you're in pain. Or what if we have activity in your brain that suggests that you're in pain, but not in your spoken conversation about it? Which one of those do we believe? Do these ethical issues call for new ethical and regulatory guidelines? Well, mobile computing devices and biosensors are evolving quickly, and technology is moving faster than regulation. There are thousands of apps that have no supporting data and give poor advice. In fact, most of the mental wellness developed apps, or even the mental health care related apps that are commercially available, use a template privacy document that doesn't actually match what they're doing. But they have it in there, so it's okay. And there's such high turnover that it's really hard to keep up with all these apps. So the FDA has suggested digital health software pre-certification, but a lot of people will go around that by saying that they're developing a non-health related device, right? And data might fall outside the realm of HIPAA, especially when we think about social media data, right? And I mentioned before, informed consent procedures may not be adequately prepared for data use and reuse. And we have to manage this public-private partnership and tensions that arise from use of public data. So who is going to own these data? Who's going to be the gatekeeper of these data? And what kind of guidance do we have to IRBs for protecting privacy when we don't even understand the extent of those privacy violations yet, the potential of them? So how do we maintain trust and respect for persons? Data collection and technologies that collect them, as well as the legacy use of those data, are really difficult to explain and really difficult to predict. So to empower participants, we really need to be able to let them know the honest state of where things are. And another issue is informed consent. So often when you consent to use these technologies, you sign off to their privacy documents, we think that that's done. But informed consent is actually a process, not a moment. And we need to remind participants of that, and also the creators of these technologies. And how to empower patients, we really don't have a full spectrum of participant perspectives about data sharing. There's been a preliminary study done that is, I hope, impressed finally. But I think I can tell you that basically participants do not understand how their brain data could be used in the public, or in how their brain data could be used beyond their the setting where the brain data was collected. So if you ask them about how they rank different data about them and privacy, people are very concerned about their social security numbers and their credit card information, and their texts, but they're not so worried about brain-based information. So why is that? And largely, it seems to be because people don't understand how that information might be used. So I want to end with that there actually are some resources available, and there are some good groups working on this. There is at UCSD, there's the CORE network. They're connected and open research ethics group, and they have a number of resources to help guide people who are interested in thinking about IRBs or challenges in doing their research in this space. One of my colleagues, Jonathan Schuler, developed this thing called Cyber Guide. What's really fantastic about it is it has a bank of all psychology-related apps and ranks different dimensions of them, such as privacy, such as how much they're actually based on real science. It's fantastic that he does this. And I've actually looked up a few things, and they were there, and it's good. And I think you can even request they add something to their banks. Very user-friendly. And certainly this is on the radar of a lot of larger organizations like the National Academies of Science, who have put out a report on this fairly recently. So with that, I know I'm keeping you from lunch, so I decided I would end early, but I welcome questions, and thank you for your attention. Yes, please.
I was wondering if you could speak to like the potential for data getting to advertisers. Because we already have a problem with like exploitative advertising towards patients. Like if you're someone with an opioid use disorder and you go to Google and you type in like rehab near me, like there's already exploitative facilities that are poorly regulated that have paid to like pop up first in Google, and then you call that number and they convince you to go over to Florida and go to the facility. Wondering if you could speak to like the future of that.
Well, I think you spoke to, I think a more, you're talking about kind of how marketing has been using the same kind of information. I think that this is using this, in some ways, very much trying to use the same techniques, but to use it towards health. So I think unless, right now, anything that you enter into public domain is public domain. And so it can be used for advertising you goods, or it can be used for advertising you things for public health-oriented campaigns. All of that is being mined right now. So the future of that, I think, will become more sophisticated and accurate. Now, I think one of the questions is globally, how are we going to handle this? Because the EU recently passed its General Data Protection Regulation, which you might have noticed a lot of when you go to internet sites, there's another pop-up about privacy that you don't read and that you click quickly to get beyond, right? So many sites, because websites are really not geographically located, right? They are ubiquitous, and they're meant to be able to hit users from across the world. And part of the GDPR, and I spoke with one of the people who was the architects of that, one of the parts of that is there's a set of rights that are laid out. One of them is the right to be forgotten. And it's impossible to enforce, and I think they will admit that, right? But it's a symbolic statement. So what can you do in this instance? I think the first thing is that symbolic statements can actually be important in setting norms, so that publics can feel like those represent the values that they have. And all laws at their best, represent the will of the people. So I think the more that people are aware, so even if you are clicking those things, if you start to wonder, like, why is this there, the hope is that there's this raising awareness that will start to get you to trigger more searching for information on how your information might be used. But I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to monitor these things. And I think privacy is going to be impossible, complete privacy. But I think that what a better solution is going to be how we control flows of information and uses of that information, which is a little bit different of a technique. Dan?
I'm actually fascinated by this. Right after this, I'm going to GSC because we're working on an ethics and AI project, getting that off the ground right now. So I'm going to take all of this in there and pitch it to the rest of the people involved.
We can talk about that later.
Yeah, we will. So I was actually wondering about what is the notion of health that is embedded in a lot of these contexts, right? I mean, there is no medical definition of health, really, right? That's a normative notion that's imported from everyday life into these things. And so I wonder if you could say a little bit about what the sort of target of these things is. Because, of course, you've got the data, you can make arbitrarily many distinctions with them, right? And you can then get people interested in the idea that they should be optimizing themselves on all these parameters, right? And they should be constantly working the hamster wheel, trying to kind of get themselves into the newly created data-centric norms, right? But what's the thinking among people that you're talking to about this, about the idea that these are health promoting? What is the kind of normative notion of health that's behind this? Because absent any clearly articulated notion of that, one that I think gets plugged into it is a notion of being productive within the kind of, more or less capital-centric, advertising-centric regime of, continuing to be an economically productive citizen. But what are the other notions of health that are?
Dan, that's such a good question. I wish all the developers were asking that same question.
There's no motivation to answer that question.
I think it differs. So for those who are specifically saying, I'm developing something to help you with depression, they're looking at some clear markers of diagnostic pieces and looking to map on new kind of biomarkers from this data, physiological markers to this. But I think that more than that, we have wellness apps, right?
Yeah.
And I don't think those work toward an actual health goal. I think those work towards a vulnerability or lack. So what is it that you feel is lacking in your life? Well, I should be calmer, I shouldn't be stressed out by work, I should have a better job, whatever. Well, if it's none of that, it's just I'm not peaceful enough or something. And this app can offer that. So I think that's what I'm concerned about. Or it's based on you should, and not only that, lack, but you should be better than you are, and you should be better than those around you. So there's this enhancement element, which is also a fuzzy piece. So that's what I worry about. I worry about people aligning themselves with this app, people living their days by that. And what's certainly there are diagnostic lines for certain diseases, but I worry about us starting to lose the celebration of the natural variation that happens in life.
Right.
Good question. Yes.
I have a question about trust and consenting that you mentioned throughout your talk. Actually, it was a great talk. So, smartphones and our apps learn more and more about us as we use them, and we learn or we know less and less about them, which automatically creates this asymmetry in the way we use or the way we feel about these apps and smartphones. And do you think there are any sort of programs or any sort of initiatives that could establish this sort of trust, that you don't feel is exploited and just being sold to some advertising company so that they can keep selling me the smartphone cases or shoes?
Yeah. That's such an interesting point that there's this asymmetry that our technology knows more about us, and then our distance between knowing our technology is greater. And so what do you do with what kind of seems like a black box, right?
Yeah.
So some people who are computationally oriented can say more about this than I can, but there is a certain point where even the original designer of those algorithms hopes that those algorithms move on their own and in fact do some learning that will become somewhat black box to them, and to them. However, I somebody who runs a neuromarketing company the other day, and they're using a lot of this, what they call digital exhaust, all the things that you've searched, kind of what you're talking about too when you put things in the window. And what they're trying to figure out how to do is how can you allow participants to funnel some of their information or click which information goes where, and that to some extent can be helpful. But I think for that to be done really well, I think there need to be some massive empirically driven kind of focus groups to start collecting trends on people's desires for privacy and what they consider private. The tricky thing is that while all across the globe there are privacy laws and people would agree that the idea of privacy is important, the kinds of things they think should be private are different. So, I've talked with some of my colleagues in China who have kind of who have said off the record, and so I won't say who they are, but who said, gosh, you Americans, the first thing we do when we have an ethics conversation is you talk about privacy. This is meaningless to us. Why do you always do this? And I had a student who, in one of my classes, looked at the privacy statements for, I think it was Facebook, and she's Chinese, so she read it in Chinese and in English, and there were totally different privacy statements. One was just like, the English one was all kinds of complicated stuff, and the Chinese one was, I think, actually just 2 lines. And it was like, your information may go somewhere else. So I think tending to building that trust in different communities is going to be challenging. And I also want to clarify that to say, now not all Chinese people are one way and all American people are one way or anything like that, because I think we can learn a lot about, there are some Americans certainly who have the similar notions, and this varies by age group and things like that as well. So there's a lot we can learn from each other in that space, but it's largely an important area that hasn't been addressed well enough.
Very fascinating talk. So I was wondering, another side of what you were saying that, we can deduct something about your mental health from your Facebook post, maybe your Google search history, or your phone usage, to what extent, how often you call people or not, how far you are walking around or not. To what extent do we actually have a responsibility to intervene, like to provide people with the help they need? Just like with when you run an fMRI study, you are required to search for to report incidental findings, right? So, is there a flip ethical side to it as well?
I think so. Is there, is this a requirement to intervene? And I think that's, and you aligned it to this example of incidental findings, which I think is really good. And that's really what the Facebook example illustrated, I thought. This incidental finding. We thought we were sharing these other things. We thought we were collecting one kind of data, and oh my gosh, we're collecting suicide information. And do we have an obligation to intervene? And I think, I think ultimately their decision was yes. There's also kind of what I mentioned earlier. Is there an obligation to use this information beyond individual benefit, so for society? So if the UN wants to use this information to look at trends in food scarcity and prices, then should they not do that? There's an enormous bank of information that they couldn't otherwise collect. So I think that we do have those tension points. I believe how you start to resolve those is to engage the people who are putting their data in so that they know that this is happening. Thank you. You have another one?
Yeah, I have another one, which is, to what extent is this risk of decoding like private information from brains real? Because I've tried a substantial amount of decoding stuff from brains. I've also worked with a lot of computer scientists trying to decode stuff from brains, and it's really hard. I mean, I think a lot of what's reported in the findings in the literature with high accuracies is a whole lot of overfitting as well. So, what is the evidence?
I think you're right. I think that right now we still are learning a lot more about the brain. And that is why at the NIH there have been a couple workshops now about brain behavior quantification. And it was this interest in getting more detailed, more refined information. For now, a lot of that has to be invasively done in the brain, so you can do more sophisticated recording and get better temporal and spatial resolution as well. But then ultimately you want to map that onto behavior, which is where these cell phones would be helpful. So that is a future goal.
Yeah.
So, but right now, I don't think that anything we have is really going to be able to do that for most people. It's not widely available. But as I was saying earlier, my concern is that there are many multiple wearable devices that you can buy at the consumer level. And if you get used to putting this information in, that becomes the trend. And I don't know, and I'm not sure how sophisticated that brain information needs to be. Maybe to decode a mental state would be different, but to decode some other less, sleep patterns and how you move about the world, if we can re-identify so-called anonymous data from a GPS and 4 credit card purchases, sometimes 2 if they're expensive, then I don't think we need to get that much more sophisticated to be able to re-identify people in a lot of things that they aren't necessarily knowing they're sharing.
Yeah, yeah, and well, I think actually the other point you made was that maybe a bigger risk is that people expect that the brain has a lot of information. It's sort of an oracle that you are, whereas maybe we should believe more what people say they are than what's in the brain data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting point. There's this tension between subjective and objective information, and particularly in psychiatry and behavioral health. It's how come we've been relying on subjective information for a long time, and we haven't been able to move the needle. So naturally, is what kind of objective marker can we put on this? And for some people, that's an anti-stigma campaign even to legitimize the disease if we can find some sort of biological markers. But there's a fine line between that because there is still this full lived experience, and this is the Center for Mind Brain Culture for a reason, to parse out, to do justice to that. So that is something I worry about. Yeah, how do we make sure we respect both kinds of information? Thank you. Yes.
Thanks. It's really interesting. I think following on the last question about the benefits, I kind of want to push us to, are we being open enough with this kind of information, particularly in light of the benefits for mental health prediction and things like that. So I come from kind of social media mining for digital phenotyping. And the ways that I see that we're not being open enough is that there's limits about the kind of information. So right now, particular companies get to make a decision. So Twitter makes it very easily to computationally access their data, but Instagram doesn't, despite the fact that anyone could go and sort of publicly click on that. And then I especially think there's asymmetries about who gets access to information. So even within places that are very restrictive about their information, like Facebook, there's basic social scientists who work with them and collaborate with them and get access to this information. And I guess the question is, to the extent to which you think this information is really important for learning about mental illness, do we need to have a more principled way that we decide what information is open and who gets to decide how we share it?
Yeah. So you're talking about the challenges in ownership and access, and particularly across public-private partnerships, right?
Exactly.
So the public researcher, such as yourself, who wants to access the Twitter banks or Facebook or things like that on your own terms, not by working at Facebook, right? So this is something that I think is an area that needs more active discussion and some consolidation of ideas, because that is not a clear space right now. The gatekeepers and how we agree upon who gets to be a gatekeeper is not clear. Ultimately, I kind of sound like a broken record, but I think that the people who put their data into these spaces need to be able to have a say in how that happens. That's where I start first, and then move to, and that's not to say that all citizens have a sense of the best way that those data can be used, because they may not understand fully research or may not understand fully what's trying to be done, but I still think there should be an attempt to engage the citizens and say, how do you think this should be used? Who do you think should own this? That's my general feeling about it.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Thanks, Robert. Yes?
So I really enjoyed the discussion of ethics and the use of data, especially in relation to the sociological aspect of how society is going to move forward, and especially like you talked about neurodiversity movement, and like just making a bold like hypothesis, like with the use of big data and like prediction and like
can technologies such as these, which are trying to, quantitate features of people and
Yeah,
draw hard
because
lines.
I kind of share the same worries as you.
Yeah.
It's like when we are predicting more, like
Yes.
quantifying people more, like how are we like celebrating the differences that we are not able to quantify otherwise, or just other way of like looking at diversity versus like pigeonholing on like certain like aspects and variables of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so how do you make sure you don't squash variation in, right, in the public? So I think this kind of relates to Dan's question, that there needs to be an essential discussion about what is the goal that we're striving for. For example, how are we defining health? And does that picture of health include a variety of ways of behaving in a healthy state or not? And I think the way that you do that well is by being inclusive, and having as many people at the table to discuss what they think health looks like, and give opportunities to not over-police that, and make sure you're actually offering help and not offering some sort of mandatory piece. So what am I talking about there? So a lot of these technologies are really fantastic because of their potential to predict onset of disease before the disease is actually there, right? So could we intervene or change the course of someone's life so that the disease never develops? Or could we slow or modify the disease so that it never develops? So you'd have to live to 200 for that disease to happen. But what that means is we will potentially now have a new state. We have a disease state and a pre-diagnostic state. So if you're in a pre-diagnostic state, do you have a pre-existing condition? Are you required to get treatment? And if you didn't, this impacts your insurance rates later. So will this impact your employability? Let's say you're 50 and your preclinical assessment for Alzheimer's suggests that you'll have early onset. Why would I want to hire you, especially in academia when the job is the life of the mind, if I know you're not going to be able to be with us for a long time? These are types of concerns I have. Also, there's false positives, right? You may never develop these things. It's a risk, and people really, you may never develop them, and it actually doesn't matter if I tell you that you have a 99% risk or a 95% risk, because people in general do not understand risk. And I'll give you proof of that, which is the lottery. Right? So, and that, how you interpret that risk is going to be it's going to be looked at differently depending on where you stand, whether you're an insurance agency, whether you're a physician, whether you're a patient. So I think all of that, broken record, I think you need to involve the stakeholders and end users in those conversations. And I think the developers need to be intentional about why they're developing these things and transparent. Yes.
One of the greatest questions of the 20th century was the balance between nature and nurture.
Mm-hmm.
When we're speaking about these predictions, we are really pushing towards a greater objectification of the individual, assuming a great reductionism, pushing away completely the understanding, when you spoke correctly about the consent form of being a process, let alone a human being's life. This seems to be somehow out of the intellectual discourse. It's like you go, you have all those quantified parameters, and then there is even prediction about how you would develop and all the possible implications that you rightly brought up. I just want to share from the height of my advanced age, I'm sitting here and I'm so deeply sad. It's not that I'm scared of those necessarily, but there is a sense of something which is basically human and that we're losing.
Yeah, well, guess my work is done.
Drop the mic and
Well, so I will say I had a very interesting conversation, and I hope this gives you a little bit of heart, with a neuromarketer of all people, who was saying that, what they're doing with digital exhaust, which is all these, your social media, your GPS, all these things. And he was deeply concerned about communication, because he said, communication, it used to be how we got all this information, and for him, communication is something that makes us fundamentally human. It's like, that's what we do. And so he, as a startup co-founder, is actively thinking about how to include that back in the process. So I think that there are people who are questioning these things, and I think those people who are able to establish the trust, be intentional about how they develop things, I think they are going to create leading technologies, leading interventions, and as long as we keep raising awareness and allowing opportunity for stakeholder involvement, these things can get better. And these things are on the radar of a number of entities. The technology is just moving so rapidly. So it's not the end times yet.
Yeah, that's maybe why I said I'm not scared.
Yeah.
I think that people, to a lesser extent, might have similar thoughts when printing came into being.
Oh, yeah.
That you lose some communication because people start communicating with a written word rather than with a fellow neighbor. So I think that there are some options, and thank you very much for bringing them up. And yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well,
Sorry.
maybe one more, and then we'll do the.
Thank you for a wonderful and thoughtful talk. I actually wanted to follow up on two former questions. One had to do with the asymmetry problem, and I think that was something that was just gotten at again. On one hand, you have a kind of apotheosis of the progressivist rhetoric that I think is driving a lot of big data and a lot of these developments that goes back, starting back in the science revolution. And then you have human beings, and which I think gets a little bit to the last point. I guess I want to raise a philosophical issue, and that is that I think we have something deeper going on in our culture right now, and it's a sort of maybe misunderstanding of the romantic notion of creativity. That creativity has no bounds, it has no restraints, it is something that just goes. And it would seem to me that everything that you said this morning, in a way, speaks to the problem of how does, you use the term regulation, but how does one adjudicate between a large batch of human beings who do not have the expertise, the special expertises of the big data managers, the data miners, especially the algorithm creators, which is a whole other area. So I kind of want to put that out as maybe a philosophical question following up on the last two comments, which makes me less of an optimist. I guess I would become an Enlightenment skeptic because of that. How do we make ordinary human beings, you're beyond that, but I'm talking about the rest of us, how do we bring up that asymmetry so that people, ordinary people, can understand precisely these things that are moving at the speed of light, these technologies? How does one educate for that?
Thank you for that question, Barbara. I can always count on you to ask a good one like that. So how do you adjudicate between a lot of diverse perspectives and a predominant one where there's a lot of information? There's a small group of information holders with a lot of power,
Yes.
and then there's a large group of people who are giving their information but don't really know how it's being used.
Or don't even understand it. They can't name it. They can't even name or define it.
Well, this has become part of a social justice movement. And I will say that in a positive, my feeling is that, not my feeling, my participation in that has been that right now I'm part of this group called the International Brain Initiative, and this is a consortium of 7 large-scale brain initiatives around the globe that are nationally funded. And what they have done, and through a lot of our discussions, is prioritize neuroethics as a discussion that they will have. And from this effort, each brain project now has an informal or formal mechanism for neuroethics. And we bring those parties together and we discuss things just like this. And what we do is, while those are just federally funded agencies, we do feel like we have the opportunity to be a test bed for some of these things and to model behaviors that we want to push out. And to your point about public-private partnerships, we have begun conversations with transnational policymakers to bring together public and private partners to talk exactly about tech development and gatekeeping and things that you're saying. That's one element for the creators of those technologies, right? But our group is also now working on developing new ways for engagement. And engagement is a relatively new field, science engagement, actually, which surprised me, but it's about 10 years old and there's a science behind it and all of that. And this is a group that is built on the foundation of citizen empowerment. And we are working with them right now to figure out just the question you asked. How do we empower citizens to be able to get the most benefit from these technologies? And how do we also empower the developers with this information on how to create the most impactful technologies and algorithms and data sharing techniques for society? So these are in progress, and this is something that has never happened before. So it is a new time, but we've just begun.
Well, no, it's wonderful what you do.
We have a good team. Okay.
Thank you.